When you broach the subject of potentially moving mom and dad into something other than maybe their house or their apartment, and you start thinking and hearing all the terms and names and skilled nursing and assisted living and independent living and adult 55, blah, blah, blah. It can get really confusing.
Very overwhelming, isn't it? Well, we're lucky to have John Brown of Oasis Senior Advisors with us right now, and he can kind of sort things out a little bit because there are so many terms that we all need to know, John.
Hi, thanks for having me. Yeah, there are a lot of different types of senior living from, like you said, CCRCs, continuing care, residential communities, to skilled nursing, nursing homes, assisted living type B,
Mhm.
memory care, independent living, and it goes on and on. And in so many communities can kind of blur the line a little bit
Mhm.
because they can offer some care that may
Mhm.
be a little out of their area.
And you brought up a good point, which is there's also a lot of acronyms that come into play as well, which can get a little bit
Mhm.
confusing. So let's just start with a little bit of kind of explanation of just the different kinds of care that what they are and what they're not, if that makes sense. So let's just start
Sure.
with the I guess some of it is independent living and or 55 up seems pretty
Common sense.
common sense, but let's start with there.
So 55 and up apartments are just that. They're in a regular apartment, but just for residents that are over the age of 55. Some of them are even 62. But actual independent living is truly where you start kind of adding those little bits of services to make life a
Mhm.
little better.
Mhm.
Mhm.
It's more, think of independent living as a cruise ship that never leaves the dock.
Okay.
Um, so you get meals, you get housekeeping, you get, transportation, social stimulation. And
Mhm.
often they have things on premise like home health and home care so
Mhm.
that you can do some aging in place.
Mhm.
But it is still independent. You've got to be able to exit the building. You've got to
Mhm.
be able to do all your activities of daily living yourself.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So
Yeah. But then assisted living, home, and just the different levels of that. It's so confusing about, well, where should my mom or where should my dad go?
right. So assisted living is when you actually start to need the care with
Mhm.
the dressing and the bathing and the transferring and the incontinence. And then there's levels of assisted living. So you have
Mhm.
type A, which
Okay.
is a lower level, which means that that individual can actually get out of the building on their own. That person might need help with dressing or bathing, but they're still able to ambulate. They're still able to,
Mm.
evacuate on their own. A
Right.
type B is a higher level of
Mhm.
care. Often that's where you see two-person transfer. You see a higher level of med management and things like that.
Mhm.
Um, though in that scenario, they will get you out of the building if there's a fire.
Okay,
So
that's a good way to
uh,
Oh,
differentiate.
okay.
Okay,
and
interesting.
as you see, the bigger communities, the type A, are much larger, usually 100,
Mhm.
residents.
Mhm.
You start getting into the type B, they get much smaller.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So that's pretty common way to distinguish.
And then what's the difference then when with skilled nursing and or rehab? Those are still different too, aren't they?
Correct. So after assisted living, for those people that need it, you might also need memory care. So
Mhm.
memory care is a type B assisted living. It's much more structured environment for those people with dementia, Alzheimer's, and
Mhm.
things like that.
Yeah.
And then you start going into the skilled nursing and or rehab setting. So there's inpatient rehab hospital. So
Mhm.
that's an actual hospital that focuses on rehab. Then there's a skilled nursing, that is an actual hybrid of the
Mhm.
old nursing home, but
Mhm.
they've added the rehab wing. Maybe they've
Okay.
added a wing or two where they do rehab. And then you have the nursing home, and most of those don't do any rehab. It's just the old version of the nursing home.
Yeah.
Okay.
Um, so the big difference between like an inpatient rehab versus a skilled nursing rehab
Mhm.
is how it's billed on Medicare
Mhm.
and how many hours of care you get per day or how many hours of
Mhm.
therapy you get per day. So
Okay.
in an inpatient rehab, you might get 3 hours a day of intense rehab. Now that's not 3 hours of physical therapy, but it's maybe an hour of physical therapy, an hour of speech, an
Mhm.
hour of occupational therapy, and other activities. In a skilled nursing, that's on Medicare Part B,
Mhm.
and that is limited to about an hour a day. So you might get 15 minutes of physical therapy and 15 or 20 minutes of
Mhm.
occupational therapy, and then another 10 or 15 of speech. So it's just different.
I,
My head's spinning a
I feel
little
like I
bit.
should have been taking notes because I felt like you gave me about 50 different options. So,
Yeah.
so the question is, if my mom or my dad, if I think, okay, they need more than independent living, but I'm not sure what, how do I decide?
So that's kind of where we step in, because no community is the same. Even though they may all have the same licensor, they
Mhm.
don't necessarily line up with what they do. Just because they're all an example, a type A or a type B, doesn't mean that they can do a two-person transfer, or they can do a
Mhm.
Hoyer, or they can take certain med management like diabetes.
Mhm.
So I really feel, I went through this journey myself. It took me 6 months to figure it out. I know we were talking earlier and you said it took almost a year for you to figure it out.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
It can be daunting.
Mhm.
So that's why we at Oasis really focus on the care. We
Mhm.
start with every person's specific care.
Mhm.
What's their diagnosis? What's the
Mhm.
long term prognosis look like? And then we start trying to figure it out from there.
Mhm.
If you kind of, I guess, would consider, do you go car shopping by just going from lot to lot to lot, or do you
Mhm.
already have an idea of what you need or what you
Mhm.
want
Mhm.
before you step in?
Right.
You don't just walk into a dealership and go, I need a new car, right?
Mhm.
It doesn't work that way. You usually have a budget, you have an idea of what you're looking for, you want an SUV
Mhm.
or whatever. You kind of need to have the same scenario in place
Mhm.
before you even start looking at assisted living.
Because I would assume, are there assessments that are done to figure out that you qualify potentially for this care or this care, depending on what your abilities are or your health conditions, I guess, too?
So right. So in 55 plus, it's like, hey, can you move in and can you, fill out the paperwork? That's different. But when you start getting into independent living and assisted living, they want to make sure that you're going to be safe.
Mhm.
So one of the main
Mhm.
questions we always ask is, can they walk up a flight of stairs? And if the answer is no, well, then maybe it's not appropriate for independent living,
Mhm.
because they wouldn't be able to evacuate the building.
Right.
So, and then when we get into assisted living, absolutely, they have to do some form of an assessment. Now,
Mhm.
the assessment can be done many ways. The assessment can be done in person,
Mhm.
where the facility or the community comes and does an assessment. It can be done clinically, using clinical records and
Mhm.
history. So it just depends. So
Mhm.
there's a lot of ways that you can do it, but absolutely, each senior living community should do some form of an assessment to make sure that they're accepting
Mhm.
somebody that they know they can live there, or that they meet their needs.
Mhm.
Yeah. We talked about the long process that I went through with my mom because of her Alzheimer's going into memory care. And it was actually about a year and a half process.
Mhm.
So we were proactive in that respect. But a lot of times it's a crisis situation. Mom falls and breaks a hip and has to go into rehab or skilled nursing or
Mhm.
something like that. Is there a big difference in how tough it is, not only on us, but on someone like you, whether it's proactive or a crisis?
I mean, it's not a big deal for us. It really is hard on the family.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Often when you have a life event and you get into the hospital systems or medical system, everybody has their way of doing things, and
Mhm.
they're looking for their pattern, I
Mhm.
guess is the way to put it.
Yeah.
And so the hospital is going to look for the fastest way to turn, I'm sorry, but turn the bed.
Mhm.
And if they feel like, okay, we've done all we can do to help mom, it's time for her to leave, they're going to look for the fastest way that they can turn that bed and
Mhm.
and get that discharge.
Mhm.
And so that's where the family, going back to what we were talking about earlier, we really feel like everyone who has a loved one who's over the age of 75 should already have kind of their plan in place
Mhm.
for rehab and for an assisted living if they ever
Mhm.
need it,
Mhm.
because you're just one fall away,
Mhm.
and people say, well, I'll be fine, I'll just go home. You never know. You
Mhm.
never know what happens when you have a fall, or if you have a small accident,
Yeah.
or even if it's an auto accident.
Mhm.
Mhm.
So we always recommend you kind of have that plan, so that when you're stepping into that environment, you can say,
Mhm.
mom wants to go to this rehab. She's
Mhm.
already picked it out.
Mhm.
That gives you control. If you don't, what happens is often they'll come to you and say, here's a list of 3 places. Which one do you want to go to?
Mm.
And you are making decisions on the fly. And
Right.
that's where an advisor steps in and kind of helps.
Mhm.
We know all the communities, we know all the facilities, we're in and out of them every day. We know what's going on, boots on the ground, so to say.
Well, because I think it's so overwhelming when you are trying to make those decisions in a crisis, and I bet that a lot of people, it's hard to have those conversations with mom or dad proactively sometimes to say, "Hey, just in case," but I can see the value of that for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it really is to give that senior their options,
Mhm.
and hopefully let them choose. I mean, of course, in some scenarios due to dementia, they can't make those decisions,
Mhm.
but it it's also for the children, the sandwich generation. We're juggling family, we're juggling kids in school, and then all of a sudden you get a call, mom's in the hospital.
Mhm.
Is there any help that we can get if we think dad needs to go into assisted living or skilled nursing and he says, I'm fine, I'm not going anywhere? What do we do then?
Well, I mean, often our advisors and my team, we're used to dealing with that. And
Mhm.
so bringing in that third party, that person who's not connected to family, who's
Mhm.
not trying to parent the parent, who's not pushing, but giving you the options and explaining everything and explaining how, Medicare works and how what's covered, what's not. Here's our suggestions on what you should have in place.
Mhm.
It's giving them the information but not pushing them to make those decisions
Mhm.
in a vacuum.
Yeah.
Going back to your original comment, though, I mean, we've helped families in less than 3 hours, crisis situations.
Mhm.
It can be done. It's doable. It's just sad for the family to have to do that because they're not prepared.
Mhm.
So,
How much should we be thinking ahead, say in the situation of like even if in Mike's mom's situation where they knew she needed to go to memory care, she didn't need to go tomorrow, but they needed to start planning ahead and they had to wait for a spot to open up and things like that. So how much do people need to be thinking of that perspective as far as, to be able to start planning ahead so that you can potentially, is it
Move
hard to find a place? Are there situations where if you
so
have
you
a
can move when
specific,
you want to.
yeah, when you have a specific place in mind?
there's some specific things that make it very hard. Okay. The
Mhm.
more complex your medical condition makes
Mhm.
it harder. If somebody is a two-person transfer and has diabetes or sliding scale diabetes, that's going to be harder. If it's a couple and one person needs a lot of care and the other,
Mhm.
the wife is totally independent
Mhm.
and they want a two-bedroom with a study, yeah, that's going to be a little bit
Mhm.
harder and
Yeah.
that's going to be something you want to work on. But if you're talking about, just the care and just those
Mhm.
things, it can be done instantly if you're
Mhm.
doing the right type of search.
Okay.
And again, that's what our system and that's what my staff do. Everything is based on care first.
Mhm.
So we're not, if mom needs help with dressing and bathing and we're not, in a way that it can't be done scheduled, then we're
Mhm.
not going to recommend independent living. We're only going to
Mhm.
look at assisted living.
Yeah.
But if it's something where, it's mild and she doesn't have any other issues, then maybe independent living is appropriate. But it all goes back to that care. You have to start
Mhm.
with that care
Mhm.
and then expand on budget, expand on geographics.
Mhm.
Oftentimes, we run into the child really wants mom to be 5 minutes away. Well,
Mhm.
that's great. But if 5 minutes away from you, the only assisted living are things you can't afford,
Mm.
we've got to find the ones that you can afford.
Right.
That meets the care.
Right.
Yeah.
Gosh, we didn't even talk about finances, right? That's a whole nother, that's probably a whole nother topic. But yeah, that comes into play a lot because there's such a difference in prices. There's differences of the places that provide just one kind of care. And as you mentioned, the places that I know the place where my grandparents lived had independent living, skilled nursing, and what was the other thing? They had one other piece too, but had the multiple, so they were able to stay even in the same building, although not in the same apartment.
Yeah.
But yeah, there's so many pieces. If somebody, one of the things that I think is so interesting that I didn't know before is that a lot of people probably don't realize that in many ways they're familiar with what an apartment locator does, to be able to help you find the right place. And what you do is like that, but with the health piece involved, right? And
Correct.
because
Correct.
so people probably don't realize that it's a free service to people.
Correct. Our service is free. We are also one of the only ones in the industry that has confidentiality built in.
Mm,
So, unlike a lot of other internet companies that are out there, we don't give out emails or phone numbers and things like that. What we do is we give you the options based on your specific scenario, give
mhm,
you the resources. If let's say you need some
mhm,
resources, like you've got to get, you need to get power of attorney, or you need to get a will in place, or you need to
mhm,
get downside specialist, or the home sold, or reverse mortgage, whatever that is. We're going to give you that information that you need so that you can take care of mom or dad,
mhm,
but we're not going to have everybody bombard you. So
mhm,
Yeah.
you tell us what you need, what you want, and then we help you
mhm,
get through that process.
Yeah. It seems like one of the best things is you've got to be able to communicate and ask.
mhm,
Don't be afraid to ask for help,
mhm,
because a lot of us don't know what we're doing in this field.
mhm, mhm,
It is a whole industry, like you said. It's got its own jargon, it's got its
mhm,
own ways of working, and it can be daunting to families, especially transitioning from that rehab scenario,
mhm,
discharging from that hospital, and trying to figure out, what do I do next? What
mhm,
can I do next?
mhm,
Or is it okay for my loved one to go home?
mhm,
Oftentimes what we see is they're like, well, mom's going to go home when we're done. And they're not being realistic.
mhm,
And so you need that outsider approach to sit
mhm,
down and talk to you and say, okay, wait a minute. If we're here, this is about where we're going to be in 2 weeks when mom gets done.
mhm,
Let's be honest. Let's talk about it, and
mhm.
let's make sure they understand.
Yeah.
So if somebody needs to bring that third party in to try to assist them, what are the kinds of things that they should be looking for when choosing somebody to help them?
I mean, there's a lot of designations out there. I personally feel that it's the certified senior advisors is one of the better designations.
Mhm,
We are accredited. We do have to go through a rigorous training.
mhm,
We do have to do continuing education, and it's all about the well-being of a senior and taking care of them and making sure that we're treating them ethically. So, I mean, for me, it's a big deal. There are some other designations out there,
mhm,
but when you're talking about anybody in the senior industry, if they have, quote, the CSA, the certified senior advisor, they've been educated,
mhm,
then they're doing continuing education. They're held to a very high ethical standard.
mhm.
And so that to me is a very good designation to look for.
And you have that on your name, and we appreciate all that
Yeah, we
you.
do. We
Yeah,
do.
John Brown, Oasis Senior Advisors. Thanks so much for giving us so many tips today.